Okay, it's 7 o'clock, so we'll get started. So this week we're making the transition into the second section of the book, which first section was kind of like building the foundation. It kind of told we talked about the history of gaming. We talked about the different platforms that games are played on. We talked about um, the different genres and goals, and then we finally talked about who plays, like the demographics and the psychographics, and basically the whole foundation of games. So now in part two of the book, we start talking about scenarios, and basically now we go through the aspects of generalities of what make up a game to now we switch into the actual content of the games. So if you notice, as we go through the next couple chapters, this week's chapter talks about story and character development or creating the narrative. Next week we go into we start talking more about gameplay and the experience. Then we talk about building levels and creating the worlds of the game. Then we'll talk about the interface, which is creating the connection to the player. And then the last part we'll talk about in this section is the audio, um, which kind of gets us right to where we're right before spring break, which I've got to just double check, but that's when I'll also have my friend that does a lot of voiceover work and such come in and speak, and kind of just since I've just talked about the audio in the game and the different aspects of audio. It'd be interesting. I find it always interesting to have someone who works in not only creating audio. He does some audio voiceover stuff for video games and stuff, but he also does it for um, just different animation series and stuff like that. But it's just interesting to get a perspective of someone who works as a professional voiceover actor. When you're sitting there and talking about the concept of audio for games, a lot of times audio could be something that's kind of overlooked. But if you go through and get a professional's perspective, it might give you a different idea of why it's something that's important. Um, so this week we've got the in the this week's section we've got the lesson notes that we'll be going through, that I'll be talking through. We've got our quiz that's based off the chapter. Um, we've got the discussion post, which I'm going to open it up. Da-da-da. The discussion is basically it's one of the discussion posts from the questions, and it's kind of going through being we're talking about characters and stuff. In the discussion post, you're going to describe yourselves in terms of a game character, kind of talking. You don't have to hit all the points, but what are your physical and personality characteristic goals, strengths, weaknesses, likes, dislikes, general mood, and then also describe another character in the game that your character is in that you would interact with to develop the story. So it's kind of a little bit longer of a discussion post, but it's also something. It's a topic that will allow, as you guys are reading each other, interacting with in the discussion, it'll give you a chance to kind of get to know each other a little bit better. Just an interesting topic. And then for the assignment this week, I've got another video that's in here that is actually a little bit longer of a video. It's a TED Talks video by Jane McGonigal. And basically the topic she talks about is she works for a video game development company, and their their goal with the games they create is to create games that, as people are playing the games, they're actually looking to help with solve a specific problem, that's a real world problem. It's not like, trying to solve a problem of how to get to a specific, playing a puzzle game to how to get somebody from one side to the other, or things like this. This is like, you may play a puzzle game within it, and may play game type situations in it, but your results are helping gather data to create and help solve real world problems. And then actually your assignment for this week is based off that video, and it's basically watching that video, and your paper is going to be sitting there thinking of where you're discussing a game, discussing an issue that current real world issue that you think could be solved through gaming, and basically be talking about what the problem is, and how the gaming world would be able to solve that problem. And of course, with everything, if you use your outside sources for information, reference them properly in it. So that's this week's assignment. So with that, I'll come bring up our fancy slides. So like I said, this week we're going to start talking about story and character development, or creating the narrative. So one of the things with I don't want to show any of this. Sorry, I'm trying to bring there. Now I can see if like somebody raises their hand or something as we're going. I had my presenter view for PowerPoint cover up everything. So basically this week, we're starting to talk about the content of the game. So we're going to start talking first. Actually, even though it says story and character development, we'll start talking about the characters first. And then we actually talk about the storytelling elements with video game design. So the key questions that the chapter kind of goes through right here. One of the things it talks about is, obviously when you start talking story elements and start talking story elements in video games, there are going to be a lot of similarities to story elements that are used in films and movies, and all kinds of other entertainment media. But there are differences. So one of the things that the chapter discusses is kind of what some of those differences are. Next thing one of the other things it talks about is what are some traditional story structures that aren't necessarily related to video games, just story structures in general, and character archetypes that just defines what they are, because they are stuff that are used within games as well as outside of games. It covers the topic of interactivity and how it could be applied to storytelling. We're also going to discuss in the chapter what are some of the dramatic storytelling devices used in games, and how do they affect the concept of immersion, and we'll get into that a little bit as well. And then the last thing it kind of goes into is what are the different forms of character development and how do they specifically apply to game characters. So this chapter is probably one of the longer chapters, and this is going to be one of those nights where I'm going to have to pay attention to the clock, because it's one of those chapters where there's a lot of notes and stuff like that. And if we have the extra time in the schedule to where if I needed to, I could break this up into 2 weeks. So we'll kind of see how we get through it, because we've got first 4 chapters are real quick and easy, and now we're starting to get into a little bit more meat of our concept of game development and game design. So when we sit there and we first start talking about storytelling, we kind of get into the storytelling traditions. And if any of you have ever been to out to Disney World and been through Epcot, and in particularly my most favorite site in the world at Epcot, which is Spaceship Earth, and it has nothing to do with what's inside of it. It's just that happens to be the landmark for mile 26 of the Disney Marathon every year, which I do every year. If you kind of notice my medals over my shoulder from all the different races I do, the Disney Marathon is one of the races I do, and Spaceship Earth is where the finish line is shortly after. So when you see Spaceship Earth and you get close to Spaceship Earth, that means you're almost done, and you didn't die. So those are also 2 good things. But anyway, as you go through Spaceship Earth, as it currently is right now, it kind of taught the whole theme as you go through is it talks about how storytelling has evolved through time. And one of the first forms of storytelling and basically going through was your modern cave paintings and stuff like that. And these storytelling traditions, started with paintings on the wall, that they've found that, go back to, just millions of years ago. And as you go through, through the topic of Spaceship Earth and the way they go through telling the storytelling, they go through and talk about how storytelling just expanded as the ability to make it more accessible happened, with the invention of paper. Now you had something to where it wasn't written on the wall. So if you left that place, your story stayed behind, whereas now you had it on paper and you can bring it with you. And goes through all the history of that to where then it talks about the Gutenberg press, where they were able to sit there and now take books, instead of books being handwritten out, they were now able to sit there and mass produce books, all the way up to modern storytelling and going into the future. Um, Storytelling traditions have a huge factor in all of this, and how they go through. Um, and basically, the storytelling traditions kind of lead to, in telling your story, it leads to the concept of generating your ideas. So when you're sitting there, obviously the first thing in your storytelling is you have to have an idea. You have to have a thought behind your story that you want to tell. Um, in the concept of video games, the story could be something very simple. When you sit there and you look at storytelling in video games, some of the earlier big hit video games had simple stories behind them. Um, you know, the Super Mario Brothers had the story of the meager plumber trying to rescue the beauty from the beast, and all through all the levels and everything. That's what his goal was to rescue the beauty. Even going back to Donkey Kong, that same meager plumber who didn't have a name yet, trying to rescue the princess from the beast. Similar ideas, but a little bit difference in the stories as the games evolved. Um, Sometimes when you're sitting there and you're looking for your ideas aren't original stuff. Sometimes your ideas are, especially when you're sitting there and talking in games, your ideas could be adaptations. Your ideas can be an adaptation of creating a game that's an adaptation of an existing movie or a book, or you know or even television shows, because all of the above have had video games written and created with them that follow the general follow the general story of the original things, but obviously you're playing through it as opposed to watching it. S- Wrong way. So kind of going through the basic ideas in the stories, one of the first things that we have to look through in our story is our characters. So we're going to kind of go through some of the classical character archetypes that are out there. And the first and major character archetype out there is the hero. And your hero is, typically the central character, especially if it's a single player game. Um, your hero is, always someone who's going to be presented with a problem like right at the beginning of the story, and they're going to embark on a journey to solve that problem. Is essentially the hero archetype. And I keep hitting the wrong way. So your next your next kind of, if you're sitting there and talking, is almost equal importance as the hero, is your shadow character archetype. And this is an important archetype because essentially the shadow, as shadow kind of entails, it's representing the hero, like how your shadow is kind of your opposite of you. Um, it's your heroes off, it's often the hero's opposite. They're often the enemy character, the evil character in the story. Shadow typically could be an adversary who's responsible for the hero's problems. And sometimes the shadow is so well hidden that as the hero goes throughout and progresses through solving the problem, the true shadow doesn't come out and doesn't present itself until the end of the story. So those are characteristics of the shadow archetype. So the next type of archetype that's out there is the mentor. So we've talked about our hero, we've talked about our shadow. So now the mentor in the story type is someone who is going to guide and kind of almost at times teach the hero about things. Sometimes as you're going through in games, you'll have that mentor character to, as you come into a new area, a new situation, that mentor character will give you hints and tips in how they work with you to be able to sit there and work towards solving your problem. You know, the mentor is a very can be a very key character. You know, if you're, you know, a Star Wars fan, you sit there and you look within the Jedi, you look to, you know, the Yoda being the mentor for you know, being the mentor for a lot of the Jedi, you know, leading to Obi-Wan, leading to, you know, um leading to, you know, leading through all the different characters and stuff like that. That's your type of what you're talking about with your mentors. Similarly, did we okay, oh, nope, I didn't skip it. So your next type of character archetype is going to be your ally. And your ally is basically a character that helps the hero along in the process. A lot of times they could be like a non-playable character that, you know, sometimes helps him get through tougher situations, or maybe is even you know, a playable character for that second person, you know, for going through, or more often than not non-playable, because it can kind of, the ally can kind of help get you through the parts where, okay, do I go left or right? And the ally kind of starts going right, and you realize, oh, I got to follow him and go right because he knows where he's going, and I'm going the wrong way and going to go down a wormhole I don't want to. Um, you know, um, next archetype we have is the guardian. So your guardian is kind of someone who is a guardian over an area. They're kind of a gatekeeper. Their role a lot of times in the story is to impede the character's progress in moving forward towards the goal, and sometimes by using whatever means necessary. Um, and it's um, normally they'll do this by putting the hero to some sort of test. So basically, until you pass the guardian's test, they won't let you through, and that's kind of their whole role in the whole role of the guardian. Next up, we have the trickster, and the trickster is, a lot of times it's a neutral character that's thrown in the game to kind of just cause mischief and, you know, cause mayhem. You know, if when you're sitting here looking, a lot of times the trickster doesn't, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just something that's in there to mess with you. You know, maybe reduce, maybe if you're sitting there going at full health and, you know, something, and you're coming up to a key point where the game wants to make it a little bit more difficult, you hit a trickster that does something that plays some sort of trick on you that reduces your health as you head into your next milestone or something like that. um in the book it talks about a lot of times these characters can be sidekicks to our hero, or they can be sidekicks to the trickster. So it talks about you know, examples two examples it gives again are from Star Wars, which is the C3PO and R2D2 droids. They're definitely not so much characters that may cause damage to our hero, but they can cause, you know, they do fit the um neutral character that kind of sometimes causes some mischief. So now moving on, we move into the Herald. And the Herald is basically a character that's going to help facilitate change in the story and maybe provide the hero with direction. So typically, like this is your Herald is going to be a character that maybe at some point you're working towards, while the ultimate goal is not to rescue this character. um, you rescue this character from some sort of peril, and then as a reward they give you information to be able to get to the bigger goal. um, so now we talk about the protagonist, and the protagonist is a another special character within the story archetype. um, and basically it's kind of the book kind of separates this from the first group of characters that we talked about. Character archetypes is, they call them, basically say that the first group was the Jungian archetypes, and now these are more of your character types that are associated with all types of stories as well. So it's kind of, you're going to see, for example, the protagonist. The protagonist is the main character of the story, which is also the hero. But in this case, sometimes the protagonist can also be, is not always, the protagonist is not always the heroic type. But they are the main character, and they're always going to be the one that's going to be driving the story forward. And those are key points about it. They're not exactly necessarily the hero description, but again, they're the main character driving the story forward is kind of the main key about it. And of course, when you sit there, if you have a protagonist, you have an antagonist. And basically the antagonist is the story's opposite, stories opposite of the protagonist. So when we sit there and we talked about the shadow, in the shadow definition, it kind of made them as the opposite of the hero in necessarily kind of making them out to be bad or evil, where the antagonist, they may be the opposite of the protagonist, but if the protagonist of your story is a bad person, then the antagonist is the hero kind of type thing. Protagonists, antagonists aren't as cut and dry as, in good guy, bad guy type thing as, hero and shadow are. Examples of, examples that the book gives to kind of give you an idea of protagonist versus antagonist is in sitting there and thinking in political realms, the liberal versus the conservative. Neither one is evil, neither one is good necessarily, but they are opposites of each other. In ethical realms, practicing privacy versus security, how much things like that. Lifestyle preferences, do you prefer business or family? They're concepts that are opposite each other. One's not necessarily good and one's not necessarily bad. It's just the protagonist and the antagonist are two main characters, and they're just opposite of each other. When you sit there and you talk about the antagonist, there's some key things or key types that kind of go through. When you sit there and you look, and the first is kind of the transformational antagonist. Sometimes this is called if you're looking again at the hero word, this is the anti-hero. So the example the book gives is Mario versus Wario. They're essentially the same thing. The difference is, the first letter of their name is turned upside down, and they're different. And when you sit there and you look, these antagonists have some sort of transformation that make them different than the protagonist of the story. Okay, I don't want to go. So the next type of antagonist is our mistaken antagonist. And a lot of times, the mistaken antagonist in the story, they're someone that all throughout the story, you sit there and you watch the story and you think, that's the bad guy, that's the villain, that's the villain. And then you get to a point where you're like, oh my God, no, they weren't bad. Sometimes they even turn out to be the good guy. So like when you sit there and you look, one of the points it talks about is, don't confuse a mistaken antagonist with a protagonist who might have villainous tendencies. And I love the example it kind of goes through is, if you've ever watched the Showtime series Dexter, the main character or the protagonist of that story is a serial killer. So you would sit there and think, oh, he's the villain, but no, he's the protagonist, good guy. And it's not a case of mistaken. It's just, he's more just a protagonist with villainous tendencies. So then you sit there and you get into the exaggerated antagonist. And the exaggerated antagonist, they are larger than life, bizarre, sometimes even comedic villains. Um, a lot of times when you sit there and you look, the classic comedy movies, the Austin Powers movies, your Doctor Evil, he's so exaggerated in his villainous behavior. A lot of times, if you look at the any villain, pretty much any villain in the Batman series, because Batman is so subdued and Batman is so non-exaggerated in his personality, the um, DC Comics tend to make all of his villains that he goes against that exaggerated over the top antagonist. I mean, the Joker, the Riddler, the Catwoman, and I mean, pick any one of them when you watch the Batman series, or read any of the Batman comics, and you'll realize that because Batman is such a subdued protagonist, they make these exaggerated antagonists to make up for it and to kind of balance it out. And the last type of antagonist is kind of the opposite of our exaggerated, and it's the realistic. And these are the ones that are kind of the mild mannered, fairly normal characters. But on the same token, there's always something about them that seems a little creepy. Kind of going to being someone who is a fan of the series Dexter. Every series of Dexter every season of Dexter for the most part, at least in the beginning, had a main serial killer that was going through and doing all this stuff that Dexter was trying to have different interactions with and stuff. And a lot of times you'd sit there and you'd see them earlier on in the series and not realize that they were the bad guys, that they were the one doing all this because they came out as maybe just mild mannered, or they had the appearance of being a good guy, but in reality they were the ultimate bad guy in the story. So kind of sitting there and saying one of the last type of character archetypes is the co-protagonist. So in this case, it's not really just one main character, but you always have two main characters. And a lot of times these co-protagonists will join forces because, especially in games, because when you're sitting there and you're looking at like your MMOs, your massively multiplayer online games, you can't, with a massively multiplayer game, you can't have just one person being the hero. So sometimes you sit there and you have co-protagonists that that go through the story together. It's just more than one person in the story. So you have two leads. It goes through some of the at the time, some of the co-protagonists for games, Ratchet and Clank, Jak and Daxter. There's all different games that have co-protagonists like this. So kind of moving from our main characters, we're moving into the archetype of our supporting characters. And a lot of times our supporting characters, they can be pivotal characters as well. They have some sort of supporting role within the story, but that story is basically their role in that story, and what makes them pivotal is at some point in the story, the protagonist has the opportunity to walk away. And these supporting characters kind of pop in and essentially provide, they exist and they provide a means so that the main protagonist doesn't have a reason to walk away. Whether it be the supporting character that is the protagonist's best friend and he gets killed to make the protagonist want to continue on. There's just certain things with the supporting characters that the main kind of reason in the storytelling is they exist to prevent the protagonist from just walking away from the story. A lot of times in stories, these, like in game types, these are your non-playable characters, because they have such a pivotal role that if somebody were playing them and played it differently than what the role was supposed to be, it could drastically alter the way the game is played. So enough with talking about the characters, because it's kind of as you go through, you'll see there's a lot in the chapter about it. Each character type has its types, and explanation of how they are. So moving from the characters, obviously the characters are just part of it. When you sit there understanding what the characters are, we now move into kind of our traditional story structures. And the first traditional story structure is your Hollywood 3-act story structure, which means that we have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Very basic. And the purpose of the beginning, obviously, when you look at the slide to sit there, is the beginning is to capture the attention and introduce the problem. So, and when you look, most Hollywood movies, in the beginning of the movie, there's going to be something that happens to capture your attention, and then draw that attention to the problem that the rest of the movie movie, so that you follow through the story. And then after you get through that beginning, that introduction of the problem, then you're going to sit there, and then you get into the middle of the story, which is kind of where you have the heat of the story. It's going to provide the tension. It's going to sit there, and it's going to show all the process of going through, and all the things that happen as a result of the problem, all the things that are being done to come to a solution of the problem, different things like that it's going to build up on that story, so that when we come to the end, we have closure, which is what the end is purpose for, is to provide closure. It goes through, and now that now that our attention's been captured and the problem's been introduced, and we've got all this detention and met all these defeated all these obstacles in coming, we get closure, which normally involves resolving the problem. And this is your typical traditional story structure of your Hollywood 3-act. It's very basic. One of the other traditional story structures is kind of a rotating story structure, that's kind of your monomyth and hero's journey. And as you see, there's kind of 12 steps for it, because we sit there and we have just the hero lives in an ordinary world, and then at first this hero gets this call. He gets a call out to adventure, to go out into the world. And in the building of this building of this journey, there's going to be, at some point after getting the call to adventure, the hero is going to refuse this call. Not my time, whatever, however it is, in refusing the call, the hero is going to refuse the call. At some point, that refusal of the call is going to lead to a meeting with the mentor, which typically will go through and be something that goes through that kind of encourages and forces the hero into the adventure, which will mean that at that point they're going to cross their first threshold, and they're going to basically have to abandon that initial refusal and cross that threshold over into the event, into that adventure, which that's going to lead to tests, multiple tests, forming many allies and enemies. This is where you're going to go through, and in your adventure, you're going to find all these tests. You're going to find your allies. You're going to find your enemies, on way to where you approach your innermost cave, which is kind of the spot where you're fighting the deepest, darkest enemies, and your strongest allies will come out. This is where the hardest tests, and this could possibly be a time of supreme wonder or terror. This is the moment where you truly face your test to become the hero, essentially. or this leads to that moment, which is considered the ordeal. And this is the biggest challenge the hero has ever faced. It seems like something that the hero will never, not be able to um, overcome. But once the hero does overcome this ordeal, it leads to the reward, which the hero receives the reward. He seizes the sword. He gets something for surviving the ordeal. And typically typically the hero will have their moment of their road back to where now they've survived the ordeal, and now they're back to come to face the choice of, do I stay in this special world of adventure, or do I go back to my ordinary world? It's kind of, that's what the road back kind of deals with. And at some point or another, if they choose to go back to their ordinary world, they're going to face this moment of resurrection, where the ordeal once again surfaces and our hero must face death. And then depending on how, they go through and do it, the concept is the return with the elixir, which the hero truly returns back with the spoils of all the victory. And he returns changed forever. And if you sit there and you kind of if you follow any of the Marvel storytelling, in particular in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, looking at the Iron Man series, you can see this over and over again in Tony Stark's story, and some of the other ones as well. But, the hero's journey. So kind of, now that we've kind of talked about the different types of stories and the different the different structures of stories, we're going to kind of talk about, now that we've talked about our characters that are in the story, we've talked about the structures. So now we're going to talk about the elements of the story. So the first element of the story is the premise. And the premise is just simply the high concept. It's a summary. A lot of times, if it's written out, it's one or two sentences or a short paragraph, and it's the game's purpose and overall theme. And the thing about it is, the premise for the game doesn't necessarily have to appear like in a game. The premise for a game doesn't necessarily have to appear in the game. Sometimes the premise for a game is on the box cover. Sometimes when you sit there, the premise for the movie doesn't ever get revealed in the movie. It shows up in the shows up on the box cover, or shows up in the movie's description, because hardly anything comes in has boxes anymore. But basically it's a summary, and it in gaming terms, it should focus on what's unique about your turns, unique games. And the premise is something that would be used to get someone's attention. So after the premise, you have the backstory. And again, sometimes the backstory isn't a prominent feature in the game. Sometimes it may be, again, looking, since there's so many images of it within the book, the Uncharted series. You get a little in the beginning of, especially in Uncharted 4, you get a little movie clip, you get a little play, pre-part that, as you're playing through it, gives you the backstory of how you've gotten to where you are now. And the backstory is exactly that. It's it gives you all the information needed, leading up to where you're at now in the story. So kind of like the Star Wars movies, your backstory is the scroll at the very beginning of each of the movies. Your synopsis. The synopsis is also referred to as your storyline, and it can go through, and it can exist all throughout the game. And it's basically it's just the running storyline. It's trying to look for the your synopsis is just it's basically everything that everything about the story. It's what's going on throughout the story of the movie. In the book, it talks about the concept of parasocial interaction, and it's where um, in your story, in your storyline as it's going through, um, the concept of parasocial interaction is basically where people become so attached to the characters they actually believe that they're real people. Um, if you sit there, there's a lot of movies, especially with a lot of TV shows and a lot of fictional TV shows. There's times where that fictional show versus reality really gets blurred for people because there's such a connection. Um, Next story element that the book talks about is theme, and the theme is what the story is truly about. It represents, um, sometimes the story may not this may not be explicitly shared, but as you go through and you go through doing the story, you will be able to, while it may not explicitly tell you what the theme is, you'll be able to implicitly determine it by going through and playing the game. It's basically the what's the philosophical idea behind the game, or the defining question behind the game or behind the story. The next concept is kind of the setting, and the setting is or setting or in other storytelling terms would be the backdrop. So, what's the setting of the story? What is it? Is it the Old West? Is it something where you're jumping through time? Is it some sort of futuristic thing, or maybe some sort of military base? The setting is basically where the game is taking place, and this is a key thing because typically you want to have your setting match your characters. If your hero is some Wild West cowboy and you've got him in a futuristic world, it may not necessarily work. There are stories where it does work, but you'd have to be very good at telling that story to make it work. Oops, wrong way again. So the next concept is the plot. So the plot is basically how our story unfolds. Um, it's basically again what how the story unfolds as opposed to what it's about. So that the plot is how everything comes through the plot. And with the plot, there are five different concepts in it. The first is kind of the concept of balancing conflict, and that's where you sit there and you maximize the dramatic tension to sit there and use that conflict to essentially um, move the plot forward. There's the concept of shifting focus, and the shifting focus is it's basically using to where, as in going through the story, you shift focus between areas to again to keep interest in the story and to maybe widen the scope of the story and the game, and possibly lead into unexplored areas, and like I said, to build more of the plot. um Foreshadowing events are, they're kind of things that happen that are kind of ominous alerts that allows it to give the audience or give the player the hint of something bad happening, something bad that's going to happen. um Typically the foreshadowing events kind of, it's things that happen that kind of show like what could be coming, if you know that are coming soon. Suspension of disbelief. So when you sit there and you talk about with plot, especially in storytelling, sometimes you have to use suspension of disbelief, which is um, essentially you're working with the players and getting them to forget about real life and accept this artificial reality that you've created. So like in my house, my wife is a nurse and she loves watching dramas about hospitals and doctors. And at times she has a problem with her suspension of disbelief because she sits there and criticizes, oh, that would never happen in a real hospital. You got to do this. Da, 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 da." I'm like, it's a movie, you know. Um, one of my favorite shows that I used to love to watch was 24. And working where I worked during the day, it used to crack me up seeing, all these people in these super top secret, high level, places with cell phones, which by the way, never happens when you're in places that you need to use your security clearances. Um, the point is when you're sitting there and you're looking and you know how reality is, um, you have to set aside your concept of what reality is and have the suspension of disbelief to be able to understand and allow the plot of the story to go forward. Um, and then the last concept with plot is realism, and where you sit there and you look where you the contrast to suspension of disbelief to where you kind of have to put the idea of knowing what was real and put it off to the side. Um, the concept of realism is basically the game follows realistic things as closely as possible to sit there and move forward with the plot and the story of it. Um, a lot of this is kind of when we sit there and we talked about the um, game types, like the simulation types, the stories that are behind the simulation games, they have a lot of realism because if you're simulating working with something, you're going to want to have it more realistic. You don't want to have suspension of disbelief, like, a backhoe would never do this or different things like that. Okay, we're still good on time. So now that we've kind of gone through and we're building up on the story and there's like so much information in here. Um, Now we're going to sit there and specifically talk about in games and in game story, the different devices you can use within the game. So, and these are kind of things that kind of differ from traditional storytelling, and are more like specific to the games because of how games are. And the first one is interactivity. So a lot of times to be able to tell a story within a game, the story is not necessarily watching a video of two characters interact. It's you being the player interacting with other characters within the story. And this is kind of how the story gets advanced. You could be interacting with a character that tells you, like, that kind of gives you a clue as to what the next thing you should be doing is, or um, what the next goal is, or you can just be interacting with a character to find out where the nearest power up is. Different things like that. Um, One of the other things that's a game storytelling device is non-linearity. So a linear story follows a straight path. It follows straight through in time. It follows, goes through beginning, middle, end. Um, and there's times that this linear path isn't followed in games. Um, you know, they don't have to necessarily follow this linear storyline. Sometimes you may be able to sit there and, start here, do something that's closer towards the end of the story, then jump back and finish something that's towards the beginning of the story. And you don't have to do things in a linear fashion necessarily in playing a game and going through the story to still have the game story work and make sense. One of the other things that the game story device has is player control. So at some point when you're sitting there and you have a game that's telling a story, at some point that story is going to have to add in the element of player control. So where we're sitting there and we're someone who's sitting in an audience watching a movie, watching a TV show, and watching the story develop in front of us, we have no control over that story. But in a game, we have control over this. As a player, you ultimately have control over the story. You have the ability, sometimes you have the ability to customize your character. And as you go through the story, you get different, as rewards, you get different elements that you can customize and make your character different. There's so many ways that the story of the game can, basically change based on who's playing the game and how they play it. If I sit there and I go through and I play a game, the story of the game is going to be drastically different than my son when he goes through and plays a game. And the story is a lot different because it never happens if it's my wife playing the game. It's different things. So sometimes when you're sitting there and you're talking in game storytelling devices, you have the concept of collaboration. A lot of times this happens in multiplayer games. One of the big multiplayer games out there now that a lot of people are out there playing is Among Us, to where, you've got the simple story of, however many characters, I think it's up to 8 or maybe 10 characters. And Among Us is a, saboteur. And there's a collaboration of the people who aren't the saboteur to go through and kind of complete tasks and find out who the saboteur is. Well, as you sit there and you look, when you're sitting there and you're looking, because it's a collaborative saboteur story, because it's a collaborative storytelling environment, you have one player who may complete tasks X and Y, and you may have another one that's doing tasks A and B. And then in the process of doing that, they may see the third player who's the saboteur running around trying to go through and kill them and sabotage the mission. So that's kind of a good example of a game story that is being, ultimately being told in a collaborative manner. And obviously this tree kind of goes through and shows, another way that a story would be told in a game in a collaborative manner. So the next game story device is called the concept of immersion. And a lot of times with this is when you sit there, when you're sitting there and you're looking at the concept of immersion, it's how invested, how deep into the story can you get? When you sit there and you look, some game stories aren't that immersive, where some, like when you get done, you're like, wow, it's just, you really feel like you were part of what was going on within the game. And that's kind of the point of the immersion. If you're sitting there and you're looking, back in chapter 3, we talked about the, trying to think, when we were talking about the genres and the goals and why, kind of why people play. One of the reasons we talked about with that was there were escapism. And when you're creating a game that's looking to give someone an escape, you want to immerse them in this world. And with some of the gaming tools we have now, whether it be, going fully into the VR realm, or even just in the regular gaming realm, there's so many games out there that tackle this concept of immersion very well. In bringing, fully bringing you into this game. It's so, like I said, you find yourself deeply caught up into it. And oh, by the way, you also don't want to stop playing. Instead of sitting there and saying, oh, I'm only play for an hour and then, I'm going to go do this. 10, 12, 15 hours later, you find yourself going, oh man, I just, I was so into that. I lost track of time, like literally lost track of time. And, and one of the ways that there are two ways that the book talks about that immersion could be kind of ways to immerse you more into the game. And the first is the concept of cinematics. And the cinematics are just simply where, you know, the very first cinematic in a game um, was the little mini movie that played in Miss Pac-Man as you completed the levels and as you went through. You know, one was, you know, it was just different little things like that, but those were little cinematics that played between levels of the games. Well, now when you sit there and you look into some of the movies, some of these cinematics or cut scenes sit there, and as you're sitting there and you have maybe in a game where you have a big battle and you sit there and you strike that winning blow, it goes to a cut scene to show how the effects of that blow. Maybe you sit there and you make a choice that leads to the destruction of the world. It's a cut scene that shows everything blowing up. You know, the different things like that. Those are kind of how a lot of cinematics are used in games. And in some of the bigger games that are out there, cinematics are, you know, huge in how the story goes from, you know, where you sit there and you hit maybe a certain checkpoint. It'll go to a cinematic to sit there to move you from that checkpoint into the next part of the story to where it does it seamlessly. And then the next concept is the concept of, you know, basically the way that basically another way to help with immersion is the concept of scripted events. So where you sit there and you look, you know, the cinematics are kind of a little bit bigger, they're bigger cut scenes and everything like that. A scripted event is a little bit more of a brief sequence that kind of just it's triggered by a player's action, and it's kind of has a little bit of scripted dialogue just to kind of give you a little bit more in depth than your normal gameplay dialogue. You know, there's a lot of things where it's not as big as your cinematic, where it may be, you know, a cinematic maybe a 2-3 minute, this may be like a, you know, 10-second clip of, you know, something happening just to enhance the visual for that particular moment that normal gameplay can't handle. So before we kind of go into there, one of the things that the chapter kind of, it spends a page talking about is the concept of I'm trying to think of how to say this word, and it doesn't have any it's machinima or machinima. It's basically the blend of machine and cinema. And the machine, and as we'll go forward, and we'll kind of get into this concept more as we get further along in the course, but it's basically the machine in this case is your game engine, whether it be, you know, whatever type of game engine that was written. And it's kind of the using that game engine to create you know, animated movies instead of the game. And it's used, there's a lot of things where it's used in and stuff like that, but it's just another concept to take cinematics and cut scenes and stuff just a little bit further. So it's not necessarily like where like your cut scenes and your cinematics are stuff that may be produced outside of the machine, outside of the game engine and stuff like that, and they have more video quality with them. Your machina, your machine in the machine in cinema, it's where they use the game engine to go through and do these little cut scenes and stuff like that instead to make it still where it's immersive and stuff like that. So now that we've kind of gone through, and I'm trying to sit there because we still have a lot more, and I'm looking at time. So looking in, now we're going to sit there and kind of switch back to our characters. So now that we talked about the character types, we're going to sit there and we're going to talk about just game characters in general. So the first thing we have with our game characters is we have our player characters. And a lot of games we have the concept of, you know, some sort of avatar that represents the player within the game. Um, as you're going through, you're playing the game. It's basically you have this main character or avatar that represents you as you're playing the game. And as you're going through, you have the option sometimes of choosing what character you get to play. But the whole point is, your player characters or avatars are the characters that are in the game that are controlled by the player. And opposed to the ones that are controlled by the player, we have our non-player characters or NPCs. So these are the characters that are not controlled by the game. They're not controlled by the player. They're controlled by the game engine, and their abilities or lack of abilities are controlled by the artificial intelligence or AI settings in AI engine. So sometimes if you've got the AI settings turned down, they're super easy to beat, and sometimes they're near impossible to beat. And it all depends on how you set things up. So when you sit there and you look, there's five common character types. Now, when I sit there and I say character types, we're not talking character archetypes, hero, and all that. We're talking character types, like we're talking animal, Sonic the Hedgehog, Mickey Mouse, Bugs Bunny, animal, fantasy characters. So when you sit there, fantasy characters are characters that don't necessarily have a counterpart in the real world to fit into. So the book talks about Mario, Luigi, and Wario, being ones, but it also talks about Lara Croft, Duke Nukem, Pac-Man. Those are kind of the fantasy type characters. Historical characters. They're characters based on, they have distinct characters in the real world. When you're sitting there, if you're playing a game, you can play a game, maybe as Ben Franklin, or play a game as William Wallace, or maybe play something as Emperor Nero or Alexander the Great. They have specific historical characters to where the character is tied to an actual person that is living or lived. The next type of character is licensed character, and this is also a character that already exists in the real world, but it's licensed from someplace else. So in this case, you sit there, it could be licensed from comic books, films, television, your James Bonds, Frodo, Neo from The Matrix, Harry Potter, Bart Simpson. You get the idea. And then the last common character type is your mythic. And a lot of these have, fit into where they have some sort of counterpart in mythology or from other worlds. So this is a lot of times where, like, your fantasy stories, they kind of use the mythic character types in going through that. And again, these character types doesn't necessarily mean that one character type is always going to be an NPC where another is going to be a player controller. Typically, all of these character types can be NPC or player controlled or both. So now that we've talked about character, we want to talk about our character development stuff. So one of the ways that we can go through and we can develop the character is your simple classic love triangle. We have our protagonist, our antagonist. They both have the same love interest. And because they both have the same love interest, they dislike each other. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're opposite. They are, they're basically two characters that are pursuing the same common goal or same common love interest. And, they basically are looking to, they dislike each other partially because of that, and partially probably because there's a lot of difference between them and stuff like that. So in talking about character development, a lot of times when you sit there throughout a game, a lot of times in the story, the protagonist will rarely change during the story, but there's times where it kind of does. But you always have this character arc that's divine, that's kind of that's kind of showing in this chart here. And this character art is basically, it shows how they go through and develop with as it says, increasing self-actualization. So typically it starts off where your character, your protagonist is very intrapersonal. And what I mean by intrapersonal is they're only concerned with his or her own self. You know, they only where it's all about them. It's all about them. It's all about their needs. It's all about their thoughts. It's all about them. From there, they kind of expand into an interpersonal type of relationship where they may bond with another character in a one-on-one relationship. And then that kind of builds them to where now it's not necessarily all about them. Now it becomes all about them and the other person. It's, you know, there's more of a relationship there. From there, a lot of times the character will develop even further into where now it becomes not, it's just, they become part of a team. So now it's just not about them and another person. It's about all the members on their team. So now you're talking maybe, you know, instead of it being about 2 people, now it's all about 5 people for them. And then as they grow and they have more self-actualization, then they become possibly part of a community, which is a larger, more organized network. It's a bigger circle of people, you know, instead of this team of 5, this team of 10, you know, now we're talking about a community where now their focus becomes on the community. And then finally, as the protagonist grows, their focus becomes on humanity. So basically it goes from being all about them to a focus that's really not, if you're focused on humanity, it's on focus on everybody else kind of but yourself. It's kind of, that's the growth when you sit there. That's one of the ways of developing a character. And you could see that, you know, as you see this intrapersonal growth through a humanity focused development, you can also sit there and see, as we talked about some of the character and some of the storytelling models, you can see where that growth would fit into it. So talking about sitting there and going from character development, talking about point of views for characters. So one of the first character point of views in a game is your first person. A lot of times it's referred to as your FPS or your first person shooter, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a shooter. It's just basically your first person. Whereas when you're playing the game and you're walking through the world of the game and walking through the story of the game, you're looking at it as, you're looking through a view as you were the one walking through. You're looking at it as you're looking through your own eyes into the world. You don't see yourself, you see everybody but yourself, if that makes sense. The second type of point of view is third person. And when you sit there and you look at third person point of view, you're still focused on an individual character, but instead of looking at it from being that character, you're looking at it from a past perspective of a third person looking down on that character. The focus is still, the key with this point of view is the focus is still on that one character. As the world moves, the camera and the focus of the view stays within that camera. You may be able to rotate around. You know, it's just a different point. It's just a different point of view. Both of these are still point of views are still focused on one person. So we kind of looking into, we'll kind of get back to point of views, but there are other point of views that are out there that you can go through, that we'll go through. But the 2 main ones that the chapter right now kind of goes through kind of are the main points of it. So now when we sit there and we look, as you go through, one of the other concepts in character development is a visual character development. And this character development is, it's all about the physical characteristics of the character. And this is very art driven. A lot of times when you sit there and you're working through and you're visually developing the character, you're going to go through several techniques. And these techniques in in your visual character development, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go through with concept art. So when you sit there and you talk about concept art, this is, let's see if my mouse, here's my mouse, I should be able to see. So when you sit there and you look at the concept art, you see this very vague image that kind of develops into the concept that develops into this concept of this character. From that concept art, now you're going to sit there and you're going to go through and you're going to build a model of the character. So the model of the character and modeling of the character is going to be not so much what we're seeing here, but if you can sit there and you can think of it, building the bones, building the frame of the character. Then from there, you're going to go through to texturing the characters. So in other words, you're going to take those bones and frame and you're going to make them look like this again. You're going to sit there and take that bones and frames you use to build this character up based on the concept art, and now you're going to apply a texture on it to make it look like make it look visually like the character. And then the last step is using all those things that you've put together, using the model, making sure that it moves with the texture. You're going to animate the character to make it move. And that's kind of how you work through from beginning to end and going through doing your visual character development. So when we're sitting there and we're talking about our visual character development, one of the things you want to talk about is you want to talk about style. And when you're developing a character visually, you want to make sure that the style of the character matches the environment, that matches matches everything, unless of course your story says it should otherwise. But typically when you're sitting there going through, if you have having a Wild West hero in a futuristic sci-fi type environment doesn't always necessarily work. Having a caveman in that type of environment doesn't always necessarily work. So there's times where it does, but the style of your character should ultimately match the style of your environment. If they're drawn the same, it could fit in with the story, but you don't want to have mixing styles. So going past the visual point, you want to sit there and you also want to have verbal character development. And one of the first ways is through narration and monologue. And the narration is basically verbal commentator made by a narrator, which is possibly somebody that's not part of the game. Possibly it could be somebody that's part of the game, but it's a narrator that narrates things that are going on. It could help with narrating the backstory. Now it could help with narrating, like, okay, I've just completed a level. Now it's narrating what's happened between level 1 and what's put you into where you're at level 2 now. Whereas you have the concept of a monologue. The monologue is typically given by a character that's in the story. And the monologue could be used to where you're sitting there and it kind of gives you the concept and it helps develop the character in giving you an idea of what their emotions are. So if you have a character who has a monologue with themselves that's very, very angry, you're understanding, okay, well, going into this next part of the story, he's angry going into it. Whereas if he's sad because he lost someone, the monologue could be give you clues into the mentality of the character. And I'm looking to see, I don't want to rush through, but so other ways that you can verbally develop a character is through dialogue. So one of the and dialogue is dialogue between two characters, two characters within the story. A lot of things with dialogue can reveal things about the character. It can reveal personality. It can reveal things about the background. It can reveal a lot of things. Like there's a lot of things that in dialogue you can reveal about someone's personality by how they interact with people. It could also reveal emotions, how you interact with people. If you interact with people where you're short, very curt and stuff, you can reveal, emotion of being angry or sad or being happy and things like that. Dialogue could sit there and be conversations between two characters that advance the plot, that help you move forward along in the story. Or as we're going through, dialogue could also sit there and reveal conflict. As you walk up and you see some stranger that comes up and starts talking to you, it could reveal in that conversation a future conflict or foreshadow a future conflict between them. Dialogue is definitely good in story development to establish relationships between people. As you have dialogue between people, it's very easy to see relationships between them. And then the last thing that you can see within dialogue is it can also provide a commentary on action. You could have two non-player characters that you're hearing have a conversation about the stuff that you're doing that is kind of a commentary on the action that's going on. You know, saying whether you're doing well, whether you're not doing well, how you're doing. So the last section we will be talking about, I believe, yes, is movement. So when you sit there and you look, in character development, movement is kind of key. Your characters are going to have some specific movement that they have. You're going to have, when you sit there and you look, you're going to have a signature move. It's essentially, it's going to be something they do that lets you know that only that character does. It could be a signature fight move. It's going to be something that's signature to that character. You know, sometimes it's gesture, sometimes, but it's stuff to show, you know, to develop the character, showcase the character. Your idle movement. Your idle movement is basically what the character does when they're standing still. In the Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic had several idle movements, idle animations that happened to sit there and show that he wasn't happy that you had him waiting around. Your next is going to be your walking cycle. It's going to be showing, you know, your animation of, you know, walking. And when we sit there and say walking cycle, at some point you're going to transition from walking to running, to be able to sit there and, you know, how you move other than how you walk, how you run, how you jump, how you squat, how you duck, how you know, roll if you have to. Those are all kind of parts of the walking cycle. So the last thing when you're sitting there talking about with the character is you're talking about the background, history, and advancement. So this kind of gives you an idea of the character's social background. So what class are they? What race are they? You know, sometimes class and race make a big difference in the character story. Sometimes it doesn't. When you're sitting there talking about the background, history, and advancement of a character, knowing the skill of the character, knowing how the skill is progressing throughout the story. The more skill you have, the more abilities you have, typically in game type things. So that's something that falls into the character development and character things. Your character, you know, simple character description: name, type, gender, age, physical appearance, background and history, personality characteristic. Those are all key things in sitting there and going through and understanding a character. This kind of falls into why I have the discussion post there about, you know, developing a character based after you. And so obviously I'm not going to read through all the different points that we've covered, but this is the summary of what the chapter says. If you read through, it's a little bit longer of a chapter. It's got a lot of information, and it's all about storytelling and about character development, because these are all key things in going through that as you go through and kind of come up with what the basis of your story is going to be. The next most important part to your having the story is the characters within the story to tell it. And one of the things is, so when you sit there and you look, the last point it talks about is game storytelling and documentation. And basically the chapter talks briefly about, once you've come up with the game story, you need to incorporate components of the story into several game documents. And as we get into chapter 10 of the book, it goes into more detail. But basically what these documents are going to do is organize your ideas clearly and convey them to others, because you can have the greatest concept of a story, you can have the greatest idea, but if you can't get it down on paper for others to understand, it's going to be a lot harder to build that into the game you want to have. So when you sit there and you look, and it kind of talks real quick about the different documents that this is going to go through. It's going to start with the concept document that expresses the basic vision. which is then going to expand into proposal, which is more in-depth detail on the story and the character. Where you're getting now you're getting into a 1 and 2 page summary of the story. And then basically you're going to build into almost a standard script that kind of scripts out the whole story as you from beginning to end and going through to be able to used to be able to build the game to be able to tell that story. But those are just kind of the different things. So the eyes aren't as glossed over this week. There's a lot that's covered in this chapter because it's kind of a key thing, a key point in our transition into building our games. And this is even though it's not considered foundational, if you don't have this down, you can't go any further in building your game, because if you don't have the characters and the story as basic as it could be, you're not going to be able to do any, kind of go towards developing the other parts of it. So that it is foundational in the content world. So does anybody have any questions on any of this stuff? Is everybody still like, sitting there?
I did have something I wanted to ask about. I remember you mentioned Mario and like the damsel in distress like type plot that was prominent in like classic games and stuff. Um, it's it's less of a question, more just like a. I remember as well, like the next game that came out, like the DK series, was like showing Mario actually being like the I don't know, whoever ran like the circus, I guess, for like Donkey Kong or whatever. He had Donkey Kong trapped, and you had to like use his baby to like free Donkey Kong. And it's just kind of crazy that they changed it from like something like damsel in distress, like it used to be, and into giving more depth to the character in that sense, and
Yeah.
like such a simpler game.
Yeah. If you definitely look at there's definitely a lot more depth to Mario. I mean, enough depth and enough to the story where they were able to make a movie about it. Not that good of a movie, but they did make a movie about Mario Brothers.
Sure did. I still haven't seen that movie. I should probably watch it.
Any other questions? Sometimes if you're looking at my video and you see me look off to the left, that's because all of you are on my monitor to the left now. Oh, wow. Oh, you just brought up one of my favorite movies. So in the chat, Samantha brought up about a good example of demonstrating the character arc is the movie Gran Torino. And I couldn't agree with you more about how you sit there and even sitting there and showing your protagonist as maybe your protagonist starting off as more the antagonist and becoming becoming that hidden hero and stuff like that. But great movie. Now it's making me want to go watch it again. But as you see, but now that kind of gets you thinking into the concept of storytelling, because the storytelling in movies is not that much different than the storytelling in video games necessarily. Sometimes it's a lot. The video game stories are a lot less in depth. Sometimes they're more in depth because of the interactivity and because of the player having control over certain aspects of it. And you can sit there and you can want to guide a game story down a path like a movie. Like when you sit there and you play the games like the Uncharted series, it guides you through a story that's almost that is a movie type story. But if you get stuck and you keep going left when it wants you to go right, that story is not going to make that much sense at that point. There's always that player element involved with it. So if nobody has any questions, it's actually almost like officially end time for class. So I'm going to wrap it up there. As we get towards, we should be like right about the time if I've got my calendar right, and I may have my calendar on here wrong because I see I have two things for February 28th. So right around either before spring break, the college spring break, because the spring break begins on this like around March 7th or is around that time frame. Right, or either before or after is when we'll be hitting the chapter on audio, and that's when I'll be bringing in my friend that does like the voiceover stuff and everything like that. And you guys will like that class because that's a class where it's pretty much you sit there and listen to him talk, and he's quite an entertaining individual. Kind of a little bit of his background. He while he was, involved in theater and everything like that, he also actually is a practicing lawyer as well. So he kind of has an interesting background. Last year's class got to hear a little of the conversation of he and I beforehand, which was even more interesting. But if you guys don't have any other questions or anything like that, I shall see you next week. Again, here's the assignments. We've got typical quiz, discussion post, and assignment. And this week's assignment is based on this video. And it's a very interesting video, very interesting TED Talk. I think I have one more that I use in the class that kind of deals with gaming as well. So with that, we're done. So,
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great week.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
You.